Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to I think what's going to be a really exciting panel discussion regarding how we monitor the progress of our students and improving their outcomes. And I'm Alex Kelly. I'm the Chief of Staff with the Florida Department of Education. I've been with the department going on almost 2 years now, and really spent actually a little bit more than now 20 years in Florida state government, in and around state government. And the panel that we have here today, I think is a really exciting panel. This is a really diverse group of thought leaders. And one of the neat things about this panel, who you'll hear from here in a little bit, is that actually we've been working together for the entire year on this topic. So this group actually came together earlier in the year around as part of a steering committee for our department regarding a planning grant that we received from the Gates and Walton Foundations, and they've been guiding us through a year-long discussion, research, diving deep into this topic. So this is kind of exciting for us and kind of neat for you, for those of you who are listening today, is because actually you're going to get to hear and judge and give feedback on and ask questions about work that we're actually bringing in for a landing right now. So you might have feedback or questions or input, and it might guide us as we kind of bring that work in for a conclusion. We've been working on what's called a New Measures and Innovations in Assessment planning grant. And our focus as a group has been kind of the beginning of our focus and the end of our focus has been on how it is that we communicate assessment results to teachers, students, to parents, to all stakeholders. And what's interesting about that is that we went through a pretty significant process of taking survey data of about 3,500 teachers, parents, even some students. We had empathy interviews that were conducted by a number of the steering committee members. And then we did focus grouping. And in that process, we found some really interesting and informative tension points. We found a lot of support, actually, for assessments. It's always depending on how you ask the question, of course, but we actually found a lot of support from parents and teachers for assessments if, and I'll put a little disclaimer there, if you narrow the topic of assessments to how assessments inform helping students improve. So if the conversation of assessments is about student growth, we actually found a lot of support for assessments. And I'll throw out one data point, just one data point that I thought was kind of interesting. 85% of the respondents to our survey, parents and teachers, told us that they're most comfortable talking about assessments, talking about students' progress when it's a conversation between the teacher and the parent. And that's a great data point because in this year where I think all of us have realized that our educational world is probably going to be forever a little bit different than we're used to. That quickly told us that wherever the conversation we're having today, the conversation that our steering committee, this panel is having, we have to inform that discussion. We have to empower that discussion between the parent and the teacher if we're ultimately going to be successful. And in that process and how we kind of come to, the title and the topic of this panel discussion is we frequently had a sidebar about progress monitoring assessments because those assessments give an opportunity to inform during the educational process, inform the teacher, the student, the parent, and whether you call them check-in assessments, through course assessments, this became a frequent sidebar of ours, and we learned a lot. In this panel, who I'm gonna let them introduce themselves, this panel really drilled down into that topic and all the facets of it. With that said, I'm going to ask, we'll start with Brandon. I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves and just kind of, and maybe say for all of you, why it is that you're so passionate about this topic. So Brandon.
Good afternoon, Brandon Johnson, Principal of Sarasota County Schools at Northport High School. And great job, Alex. For me, I guess why I was so passionate, to be very honest, is when everything happened and the pandemic hit, is that we realized that we needed to do more than just rely on end of the year assessments. I mean, clearly the sidebar conversations Alex is talking about was very clear that progress monitoring played a huge role in making and ensuring that we had data leading up to the end. And so Alex, for me and the committee that we were on and everything we did, as you called it, coming to a landing, it's been imperative that I share kind of my feelings as a principal in a comprehensive high school of 2,400 kids, that where assessment is huge in school grade, but also what other things we need to do as we go along. So just nice to be here.
Angie Gallo. Angie, why don't you introduce yourself? And same question, why are you so passionate about this topic?
Thank you, Alex. I'm Angie Gallo. I'm actually a school board member in Orange County, Florida, for District 1, and I also sit on the board of directors for Florida PTA. So I think why I'm so passionate about it is, absolutely, as a school board member, that data is imperative, so that we can reduce the inequities that we have across our schools. But it's also the data. The Florida PTA has been doing a Data for Good grant. We're actually bringing it in for the landing at the end of this year. It's a 2-year grant, and we've kind of did a deep dive into school report cards and that data and try to educate parents on the importance of that data and how they could use it to advocate for their children. So I come up from a place of advocacy and trying to help parents understand the data and why the data is important. So that's why it's so neat to me. And I've enjoyed immensely being on the steering committee with everybody. It's been a great time. Thank you.
Thank you. And Superintendent Mike Grego, now your turn, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. And Mike Grego, Superintendent, Pinellas County, Florida. I've been superintendent here for just finished 8 years and having a great time. And certainly want to thank Alex and the department for bringing what I think is a wonderful cross section of a committee together to talk about this topic of assessment. As you've heard, we've had a school board member, a person involved with PTA, a principal, we have some teachers. And so it's been great conversation. Why I'm excited about this is I view the current time as we use the word pivot a lot lately, but as a means of pivoting to increasing and the importance of not only importance, but relevancy of assessment in the state of Florida. The state of Florida has been seen as a leader in this area, and a firm belief if you just stay too stagnant, you are no longer lead. So I think this is a great opportunity for us to all reflect and to take inventory of where we have come from, where we're at, and our potential of where we're going.
Excellent. And our last esteemed member of the panel, and I will say my former coworker for many years, as we used to torture legislators in nearly 50 states around the country on a regular basis, Claire Voorhees of the Walton Foundation.
Thanks so much, Al. I'm truly honored to be part of this group and want to acknowledge it. It goes without saying that you all are the ones on the front lines doing the actual work, and I'm grateful to be a part of this group and to have learned from you along this process that we've kicked off. Speaking on behalf of the Walton Foundation, Walton Family Foundation, I think we invest in innovative assessments, and in particular in this planning grant and RFP process with states and CMOs. At two main reasons. One, at a programmatic level, where of course, like you all see assessments as the key lever for promoting equitable outcomes, informing families, giving folks like you the information they need to get schools the supports they need. Stepping back a second for a political and strategic level as a funder, we see it also this investments in assessment, but also this particular program as an opportunity to create proof points. I think none of us are quite satisfied with what tests are today. We have a vision for a future of assessments. I'll touch on that a bit later, but our goal really is to learn from states like Florida and the experiences they're having and improving their assessments to meet the needs of their students. And we hope to create proof points and then ultimately, frankly, inform the next reauthorization of federal law so that we in the right ways give states the flexibility to innovate and have the tools they need for kids. So again, thank you for being here. I look forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you, Claire. And I want to maybe start with a question for all the panelists. Pick up on a point that it came up in some of the comments there, which was, so this past spring is a little unique because we don't have data for the most part from most state assessments this past spring. And so, from that point of view, reflecting on that, and again, Brandon, let's start with you. Given that, what have you learned about the role of assessments and the implications of that? And this question is really for everybody. So when Brandon's done, somebody else just feel free to jump in.
No, I mean, when we were basically third quarter for the fourth quarter of the school year, I think everyone's well aware that we were remote learners. And then, of course, when it came down, we wouldn't actually have state assessments. The first thing we started to look back at on our campus was what data did we have? Because the reality was, even at the end of the year, we were still responsible for scheduling students, making sure students were in the right programs. And so sometimes we forget that end of the year assessment really does play a major role, if we like it or not, in where students end up and what programs they take. And so for us, we went back and started looking at the progress monitoring tools that we had in place, common assessments, so that we could actually go back, look at the data, and make determinations for this upcoming school year based on that information, Alex. You fast forward to the beginning of this school year, we had to do pre-assessments on every single student. And part of that was to kind of look for the COVID slide, if you want to call it that, and then to be very fair to students, were they actually in the proper place or the program that they needed to be in. And so not having that assessment wasn't the worst thing to ever happen, but it definitely made us reflect and think about, as we're going throughout this particular year, are we doing everything in our power when it comes to common assessments, progress monitoring, adaptive assessments? Are we communicating with parents along the way with their students, how they're performing? Because as we go throughout this year, I still don't know exactly at the end of the year what will happen, sir. Even though I know right now, we know we're looking at doing standardized assessments, but it's given us a new lens about what we should be doing to support students and help them along the way, and not wait to the end of the year to make a determination on if they're in a gifted program, a BPA program, so on and so forth.
Excellent. And who wants to jump in and follow up Brandon's thought?
I'll follow Brandon because I want to tie in what you said before, Alex, about the parents really, the desire to learn about how their students are doing, and that 80% of the parents responded to that survey. And Brandon's comments were right on. And the reality of it is that maybe we're too reliant on state assessments, and that in the whole process of teaching and learning, we need to know where our students are. And so do our parents, and so do our teachers. We conducted parent-student survey, not surveys, conferences for the first time because of this pandemic. And we learned a lot from that, because we reached out and had really honest conversations about where their students were, where they weren't, and where they needed to be. We helped plan the scheduling of a summer remote program, and then leading into the school year. And it really should have caused, as it did us, a really true reflection on, so why are we so either reliant, or let's make sure assessments truly have a purpose for them, so that we're able to use them and the students and parents are able to use the results of those assessments.
Angie, I'd love to get your thoughts at the end of that of are we over reliant on the end of the year state assessments?
I think so. There is a lot of reliance on those end of year assessments, and a lot of effort and thought, and where we place kids, as both the previous speakers spoke about. So yeah, there's a lot of emphasis, and I think that we are too reliant on those tests at times. I think that when we look at metrics, we probably need to include some more metrics than just one single test when we look at the progress monitoring of our students. With that being said, it's really the deliverables. It's what we give to teachers and what we give to parents. Like, a teacher shouldn't have to have a PhD in data sets to be able to understand our deliverables when we give to them. They should be easy, and I think we've talked a lot about this as a steering committee, and that final product, what we give to them and how they can interpret it and then share it with a parent. I think that's the most important part. So we've kind of lost out on that, and I think what we found at the beginning of the year with our progress monitoring is that the COVID slide was probably deeper than we first anticipated. So hopefully we'll pull it together and get the resources that we need so that we can help these kids catch up. It's going to be a tough year.
Claire, your thoughts?
Yes, you have two responses to, are we over reliant on statewide tests? I mean, I think on the one hand, they do provide a certain type of information that at this point at least cannot be captured by these other tools in terms of statewide comparable data. So give that credit where credit's due. Like, I think what this spring and even this last spring and even this year give us the opportunity is, one is just really focusing on the fact that there are, of course, there are many other measures that matter, not even the interim academic ones, but with the crises that have the multiple crises that have hit this country around SEL, and thinking about the other things that kids need, and how do we measure those, and who measures those. So I'd say there's that piece of it. And the other piece, I mean, to be fair to statewide assessments, we've used them for things, or tried to use them for things that they weren't intended to do. So I think we need to be really careful in this conversation around use case, and the assessments that we've designed for statewide use do certain things well, and they do other things poorly. Now we can try to innovate and change them so that they can do multiple things better. I think that's our goal. But right now, I think sometimes we've, again, just expected things from the tests around, immediate feedback and things like that just they weren't designed to do, at least not yet.
Well, and so maybe finishing where Claire and Angie, you finished, in terms of what tests are designed or not designed to do, from an educational inequity standpoint. And you could look at this from the pro or con side in terms of how we address educational inequities. What are either assessments failing to do, or maybe what are they doing right in some cases, or maybe a little bit of both? Maybe Claire, we'll go in reverse order here to you.
I mean, yeah, statewide assessments certainly shine a light. I mean, we one thing, for those of us who've been around the policy world for long enough, do remember what things were like before. And this is not as applicable in Florida, that's been at this longer than some states, but a pre-NCLB day when we truly did not know where the gaps were and how big they were, and schools that were serving some kids well and others. So I think we have to give that credit where it's due, as I mentioned. I think to me, around equity, I think where some of the failure has been, frankly, is on the responding to the gaps. Like, we've gotten pretty good at identifying gaps. We haven't gotten good enough at closing them. That's the reality here, and given the resources that are and support that's required to do that.
Angie, I'd love your thoughts on the same question.
Thanks, Alex. I agree with Claire. I think that the tests do help us identify a problem, and they do help determine proficiency of a student. What we do with that data and how we apply resources to those students is imperative, because we know a couple of things. We know that an opportunity gap exists. So how do we close the opportunity gap so that everybody across socioeconomic status receives the same opportunities? And also, how do we make sure that those who need it most are getting the most quality teachers? I know that we struggle with putting extremely quality teachers in some of our lowest performing schools. So how do we ensure that they're getting the best resources and the most resources so that we can close that achievement gap and move forward?
Okay. Superintendent, so taking that thought, then, how would the introduction of more formative assessments, progress monitoring type assessments, how would the introduction of more formative assessments during the course of a year, how would that help that equity question, or would it help?
Yeah, I don't know whether more or less. I think more or less with a purpose is what I really would promote. And that has been spoken about by Claire and Angie too, is that we do a good job of identifying where those gaps are, and we identify those year after year, and we have certain subpopulations or underperforming subgroups. But what the real need for the assessments are to be more of an instructional prescription of how do we close that gap, and what do we need to do differently by some groups than others. We talk a lot about assessments should drive instruction. So the question is, so how will it drive instruction? How will it change practice so that those gaps don't close gradually, but rather those gaps are accelerated in closing? Let me clarify one thing when I say, are we too reliant? What I notice from a practitioner's point of view on state assessments, because I'm a firm believer in them, is that when we have, as Brandon mentioned, so how do we schedule these students without the FSA? That's where you start to become a little shaky, and you say, boy, are we, what do you mean, how do we do that? And so now I want to clarify that the reliance is that we become there's more measures, there's more things. So to answer your question, Alex, is that more or less, but rather more meaningful assessments to really drive the improvement. When we closed things down, the one entity, we had actually an increase in our students taking AP exams because the College Board went ahead and pivoted very quickly to an online exams. And we had an increase. We had an increase in some of our African American and Latino students we had over a 10% increase, and we had an increase in pass rates, by the way. And so it teaches us, it shows us that things can be done with a purpose, and where these formative assessments throughout the year can better predict the success at the end of the year. So I look at more or less to be is it a roadmap of success for the students and the parents and the community to say, if we continue on this journey, we're going to be highly successful at the summative evaluation at the end of the year, no matter what that is, if it's a state FSA, if it's an AP exam, if it's an IB exam, whatever it is, we know we're carving the pathway for success.
Brandon, would love your thoughts on the pathway the superintendent described.
No, I couldn't agree more, Superintendent. I think I love the question of more or less, because the reality is if we just do more of something and don't change actually what we're doing or actually, then to me, you're just giving me more assessments. I'll go back to what the superintendent said. One of the things I thought about as you were talking was how we actually utilize the data, right? So if you're going to do more assessments, formative assessments, then let's hope that you're utilizing that information to either find gaps and actually address those through interventions, communicate with parents throughout, and then hopefully, last but not least, get students where they need to be. I think one of the other pieces I wanted to add, Alex, really was I started to think even beyond just state assessments and ACT, SAT, when you talked about inequities, and that what we utilize some of these state assessments, of course, is to place kids in certain places, and then unfortunately we use other assessments is to place kids in colleges. And so when you go back through and you struggle in state assessments and then you struggle with SAT and ACT, to me, that's when you start to see those inequities as well, whether it's in high school in AP classes that they take, like the superintendent talked about, or IB or ACE based on those assessments, or the type of colleges that they're attending. To me, that's when I start to worry a little bit how we utilize the actual assessments. So if we're going to do more, let's hopefully be the case of formative leads to stronger scores, summative, and we're not using it, like Claire said, to give feedback on summative assessments when it's way too late, like our panel discussed even when we were in our steering committee.
Well, you bring up an interesting point in terms of how assessments and how we make that information actionable. So Brandon, maybe, think it from the perspective of as you're a principal of a school and how you work with your teachers. Could you maybe take that one step further and talk through essentially how we can, at a more granular level, make that information more actionable for everybody involved, parents, teachers, students?
That's a great question. I think I'll use what Angie said earlier. What did you say? You don't need a statistician degree or something along those lines to try to read some of the reports that come out of some of the platforms that we utilize, Alex, even besides state assessments, right? Some schools, of course, or districts use iReady or USA Test Prep, and some of the information that comes out, I think the most difficult part goes along the lines of teachers. So how do we make sure the impact that students understand and teachers understand, as well as parents, that we have to train our teachers, Alex, to understand those particular reports, understand the use of a formative assessment so that they can meet with parents and students and really break everything down. So as we're going along, they understand the information. I think some of the gaps that I noticed at my own particular school or in our county is that we do hand information to teachers and expect for them to deliver that to teachers and students, and they don't even understand the report. And so how do you take that information to the next level, or to be able to build upon or address skill gaps when you don't necessarily understand exactly what the issue is in the first place? You're just kind of handing something over. So part of our job, I believe, is whatever assessments we're using, the reports that come out, is helping people understand what they actually mean and breaking it down enough so that they can do something about it, either as a family or community, meaning your own parents, or as teachers supporting students.
Well, Alex, if I can add one thing to Brandon's, because I think it's a point that we haven't brought up, but really good formative assessments and even summative really inform the instruction too. And I know we're focused so heavily on student learning, which is good, but So if I have a school or a district as I look at, and there's certain concepts that just aren't being reached, that should drive us to change our instructional model or our instructional practices, because we think we're teaching something. Or the assessments are really, they're not a bad word, they're a good word. And truly, have these things been taught? They've been taught, but have they been learned? And so it should drive the adults in the building and the adults in the districts too. And we tend not to talk about that as much, but it's just as important.
That's excellent. And on that topic of driving instruction, Angie, I'd love it if you would you weigh in on that, maybe follow up with the superintendent's thoughts.
I couldn't agree more with what Dr. Grego said. I think that we need to change our practices if we find through the data, through the assessments, that what we're utilizing or what we're using isn't effective, and it's not helping that child or that student become proficient. We need to look at it, and we need to change the way we instruct. I also think that we need to look at early education. I think, when we get kids in at kindergarten, once they're behind, it's extremely difficult to catch them back up. So how do we focus more resources on early instruction to kind of reduce the inequities that we see in the early learning and reduce the opportunity gaps that we have at a very early age, from like 0 to 4. I think we really need to focus on that area to kind of minimize and reduce these gaps that we're seeing.
And Claire, you might coming back to Brandon's point and tying that into Angie's as well. You might be our closest thing to a statistician on this panel. So could you represent this from the the big picture statistical point of view of how all this data drives innovation at a big level?
Sure, and on this, be helpful to talk about how some other states are approaching this problem. Would that be helpful perspective?
Love it. Yep.
Sure. So yeah, I think like you guys, one thing that's good to see in the field is first of all, there is energy around this. Even before COVID, after COVID, some statistics to throw out. We started this RFP process. We had 17 states and CMOs apply. 10 won and 0 dropped out during COVID, despite all that teams like you were having to handle throughout this year. So impressive on the face of it. And what we're seeing is really an approach that there's energy around innovation, but it also is really targeted at solving some of these challenges. We all would agree, as much as we need statewide assessments, they have flaws that we could all probably mostly agree to, and some of them have come up today. The lack of connection to or benefit to instruction or meeting kids' needs, and lack of alignment to instruction. You have just not measuring the things that maybe we all care about or that parents care about or principals or teachers. And similar to that, just sort of a disconnect from what kids going on in school. So what we're seeing is really innovations targeting across some states that are really targeting or organized around those challenges. One of which, and kind of in 3 themes, one of which is the through course, which Alex mentioned, which is the idea of attempting to take a summative assessment and break it into parts and have it given throughout the year in an interim assessment. That in theory would help get quicker feedback and be able to throughout the year inform instruction. It remains to be seen whether a summative test can do that. I think over the next couple of years we'll see. It sounds great. Does it work? Some really smart folks like yourselves are working on it as we speak. The second kind of theme is the locally developed assessment and performance assessment. So things that right now, I'm sure teachers and principals are doing all the time, of performance-based assessments in the classroom or at the school level, but how do we then use those in a more summative format? Is there a way? Again, remains to be seen. They have value when done well, but can they be used for some of the same purposes as a summative and comparable across schools and districts so that they check some of those boxes in terms of being able to identify gaps, et cetera. And the third is sort of some interesting thing just around technology. I know Florida, you guys in the context of reporting are utilizing technology. There's some other states that are looking at other challenges, like how do you measure higher level skills using technology or game-based approaches and platforms. So really, really interesting time to see, and a lot of energy around those, trying to solve those challenges. Florida, as usual, is right in the mix.
Where we like to be. Before we turn it over to Q&A, I just want to take the last kind of 3 or so minutes before Q&A, direct one more question to Superintendent Grego. Just your answers got me thinking about, everyone's answers got me thinking about the schools that need that critical support, schools that are in sort of a turnaround type status. And Superintendent, our Commissioner of Education pays a lot of compliment to the way you help schools that are struggling and get them back going the right direction. And so would love it if you could take kind of the thoughts we've heard and laser focus that on schools that need that turnaround support, and how you use these data points to help that situation.
That's a good point, good question. I start with the premise that all parents want their students to succeed. And that's a very important foundation block. And how we report these assessments that we talk about is very important. It matters to parents. And there must be a parent component that is easily understood and specifically has to answer the question, so what's the next step? What's the next step if I want to help my own scholar, my own student? And it has to be parent friendly. It has to address those specific skills. And that's kind of our litmus test on when we're talking about a turnaround school. And you have to bring people together rather than lead with this assessment, identifying that there's a deficiency, but rather identifying what those strengths are and how to build upon those strengths so the deficiencies get they evaporate, they get out. And you have to build that momentum along the way. One of the things I know the commissioner was so high on what we do is we try at the very youngest age to have the student own their own education and own their growth. And they move their own potential growth along this huge data wall. And they are important and they want to be assessed. And that's when you see young people say, they don't use the word assessment, but I want to demonstrate to you, I want to show off to you all that I know because I'm proud of my learning. And if we could plant that seed early on, and regardless, in the middle and high school level too, because ultimately, if a student doesn't start to own their own education, they're not going to succeed. It can't be the nurturing love of a kindergarten, a third grade teacher does not last forever. And so they have to start to take ownership. So how can we push out those written reports that are meaningful to parents? How about interactive links or dashboards that we can say, here's what you have an opportunity to build upon, and here's how you can build upon that. And so students take that ownership, and parents too. We learned a lot through this pandemic. I have more parents engaged in their child's education than ever before. And some of those same parents that wouldn't be engaged are now engaged. Whether remote, engagement is not the physical facility or having to physically come onto a school campus. It's really the demonstration that my child's learning is very, very important and that I want to contribute to that learning. And once we get there, and the child's moving and the child's enthused about the student's enthused about it, I think assessments take on a different meaning, not only for the student, but for the parent and for the teacher then.
Well, have students own their own growth. At least once every call with you, sir, I write something down you say, and that thought. And I think I'm going to turn it over now to either Eric or Mandy for Q&A.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you to all the panelists for sharing your thoughts today. We've got a good group listening in. We've got a couple questions in the Whova. Want to remind you, if you've got questions for our panel while we have them, to please go ahead and add them. We'll pass them along. So the first question we have, leaning into the question, like what have we learned from the pandemic? What are we doing right now? Is what is the role that grades and tests play in online learning? I think that the focus or the subheading is whether children should be penalized for not having access to technology.
That's a phenomenal question. You know, maybe superintendent, we'll start with you, and then anybody else feel free to jump in.
To me, it's an easy answer to the question: should students be penalized for not having the technology? Absolutely not. I think all of us have gone to great lengths to ensure that it's there. But even though it's there, the connectivity and the engagement is another factor. We set up child study teams at every school because one of the things we have to recognize is that remote learning is not as effective as face-to-face, and I don't think we need to discover that over years of research. I think we just need to assume it. And that's the approach I'm doing. And the poorer the zip code, the greater the learning loss. And we have to aggressively go after to see if those conditions of learning exist at home. We're actually doing home visits in my district to ensure that learning environment is there. I have 14,000 students coming back into face-to-face instruction in 2 weeks. It's vital to continually assess not only the learning, but also the conditions for learning of students. And, you know, those vary depending upon where the support levels that students have. And my belief is a student should never be penalized for something that they're not in control of. And certain their conditions are not something they're totally in control of. So that's a short answer to that, but it's a good question.
Yeah, who else wants to jump in?
I'll jump in. I know my bell's going to ring in 1 minute, so I was going to mute real quick. But
It's
there
okay,
it goes.
Brandon.
What I was going to add, Superintendent Grego, is that to me, on top of that, what we've been focused on in Sarasota County are interventions for remote learners. So knowing that we've collected the data, students who are unfortunately failing, struggling, we've provided, like Dr. Grego said, the technology, right? Every student that's remote at least has access to a computer or hotspot. But what we realize is the education isn't the same, right? And for some of them, not being here and not having that interaction socially with people, they tend to struggle. So we've put in interventions quite a bit from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3, even bringing them up to SWIS, just to make sure we're identifying them on an individual basis so that we can, I guess, maybe not necessarily just do all home visits, Dr. Grego, but making sure that we're interacting with every single parent and family and student to ensure that they're getting a quality education. And the last piece of that to me is if it's not effective, you do have to have the conversation about, is it essential that you're back here on campus so that we can do a little bit more for you when you come back. So I at least wanted to add that in, Alex.
Excellent. Claire or Angie, anything to add?
I would just say I agree 100%. We've got this digital divide that we've been working with, and children should absolutely not be penalized for the lack of access. With that said, you know, this is a challenging time, so we got to create a balance of what they have available, and not just from a technology standpoint, but from an interaction or involvement of parent standpoint. We have homes that have a lot of engagement where the parents sitting next to them and they're helping them out during the day with their schoolwork and making sure they're connected and everything's working correctly. And then we have homes that just quite frankly don't have that. They have an older brother, older sister, or someone that's trying to help them out. So again, it goes back to that opportunity gap. And it's not just about the digital divide. It's just about access at home and what they have available to them at home, and how do we address that on both sides? Like, how do we address it from a child that doesn't have as much to a child whose parents are over-engaged, and maybe some of the assessments or benchmark testing that we're taking may not actually be accurate because they've gotten more help than they would, you know, say in a face-to-face classroom. So we all recognize that face-to-face is a much better learning environment for our students than being at home or technologically. But, you know, we're doing the best we can with what we've been given, but it's definitely a challenge.
I just want to add to that challenge too. I love the way the question was worded, because the crux of the question was whether we punish or not. And what we found in the data that this group took a look at during the course of the year is that if we are using that data to support and help understand how much learning that student lost during that period when maybe they were at a distance, and we help them overcome that challenge, then all of a sudden the data is welcome. If we use the data in a different manner, it's not. So I think that the way the question was asked was beautifully asked, and I think we found support for that second approach, which is that everyone described, which is to help the student use the data to overcome the challenges they experienced. Eric, I think we have a couple more questions.
Yeah, shifting gears a little bit. Let me ask a question about grade level assignments. So, getting kids access to challenging assignments in class, and I'm wondering how you see assessments playing into that, or if there are other factors that maybe play a bigger piece.
That's fantastic. Great question. Brandy, you maybe want to jump in on that one first?
Can you repeat the question? I was trying to listen through it. It kind of broke up a little bit, sir.
Sure. So thinking about grade level assignments, getting kids challenging work, I'm wondering the role assessment plays in doing that, or if there are other factors that play a bigger part.
No, that is a great question. Kind of spoke to it a little bit earlier. It does play a role. I can speak for Sarasota County, not necessarily for maybe Pinellas County, but the reality is the better that some of these students do on these state assessments, the opportunities that they have to take different classes. In turn, that means some of the assignments that they're being given from AP to ACE to IB are essentially more challenging. And how do we know that? Because we even weigh them differently, correct? We weigh general ed classes and AP classes and ACE and IB for your own grade point average. So in theory, you're essentially saying that this coursework is more difficult, hence why we give it a 1.5 added GPA or a 2.0, whatever it is that we want to add to it. So to me, it does play a difference, which is why if you go back to progress monitoring and formative assessments throughout, if we can get to the point that we're working through that process, then at least we give all kids the opportunity to be able to at least access those particular classes. Can teachers do it within their own class? 100%. I think all of us know that. That to me is pretty easy answer, elementary, middle, or high. But when I think about being able to have the opportunity for higher level classes, the state assessment does play a role.
Absolutely. Anybody else want to jump in on that question?
I'll talk about it. Great point. I know that it gets to this use case and ensuring in various ways that the tests that the kids take are in turn valuable to them as students. I think the other side of it, that's again stepping back from my 40,000 foot perspective, it's also just thinking about moving towards the structural reforms around a system of assessments and alignment, and making sure that it's aligned to not only Florida's new standards, but to high quality curriculum, and that everybody has the access. We know I think all too often that connection between curriculum and assessment is a bit lost in the shuffle. I know it's a new priority of Walton's to look into, and there's some exciting things going around the country about really making assessment much more tied to and about curriculum and learning than something that's standalone.
Excellent. Eric, I think it's about time to transition back to you, sir.
Yeah, it is. So I just want to thank everyone. I want to thank you, Chief of Staff Kelly. I want to thank our esteemed panel for being with us today and sharing your thoughts.